audiences and moving on. And then there are films like Flash Gordon. When it reached theaters in 1980, it was unlike almost anything that had come before it. A collision of primary colored spectacle, operatic performances, science fiction mythology, and a rock soundtrack that felt like a genuine act of creative audacity from a major studio production. Audiences didn't quite know what to make of it. Critics were divided, and the box office landed somewhere between modest and disappointing. Yet here we are, more than 4 decades later, and Flash Gordon hasn't faded. It has only grown stranger, richer, and more fascinating the closer you look. Because beneath the spectacle, beneath the gleaming costumes and the thunderous Queen soundtrack and Timothy Dalton's magnificent cheekbones, there was a production absolutely overflowing with secrets. Turbulent casting decisions that reshaped careers. Abandoned visions that would have produced an entirely different film. Practical effects innovations that nobody thought to write down. Franchise ambitions that collapsed before they ever launched. And, at the very beginning of it all, a single rejection that accidentally changed the course of cinema history forever. It starts, as so many things in Hollywood do, with someone being told no. In the early 1970s, a young filmmaker named George Lucas had grown up completely captivated by the original Flash Gordon serials. The rocket ships, the alien worlds, the larger-than-life villains, the sense of boundless adventure compressed into 15-minute chapters, all of it had lodged itself deep in his imagination, and he wanted to bring that energy to a new generation. When he approached the rights holders about making a Flash Gordon film, the answer was no. The property was already spoken for, and no deal could be reached. Rather than walking away defeated, Lucas stripped the concept down to its essential architecture: the heroic everyman, the wise mentor, the ruthless emperor, the princess in danger, and rebuilt it from scratch with his own mythology, his own language, and his own universe. The result premiered in 1977, 3 years before Flash Gordon reached theaters, and became one of the highest-grossing films in history. The very rejection that kept Flash Gordon out of Lucas's hands accidentally gave birth to Star Wars. When the 1980 film finally arrived, audiences were already living in a world that Flash's DNA had helped create, shaped by the franchise that only existed because the original door had been firmly closed. Before Queen entered the picture and permanently fused their identity to this film, director Mike Hodges had been developing production's tone with a very specific musical reference playing in the background. He reportedly listened to Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon repeatedly during early development, drawn to its atmospheric depth and cinematic sweep, hearing in it the right companion for a mythic space adventure. The idea never advanced far enough to become a formal offer, and Queen's arrival shifted everything. Rather than simply writing background music designed to sit beneath the action, the band embedded dialogue, sound effects, and actual character moments directly into their compositions. Lines from the film appeared mid-song, as though the music and the story were the same organism. Freddie Mercury's voice against Brian May's guitar gave the film an emotional register that no orchestral score could have provided. The opening theme alone, hammering guitar, operatic energy, and that instantly recognizable vocal hook, became one of the most recognized pieces of music from an entire decade of cinema. Whether Pink Floyd's version would have been better is impossible to say, but it's almost certain it would have produced a very different film. Queen didn't just score Flash Gordon. They became inseparable from it. What most audiences never knew was that this landmark collaboration was conducted almost entirely in secret. When one of the world's biggest rock bands agrees to score a science fiction film, you might expect the news to travel fast. Instead, the recording process was kept deliberately quiet. Rock bands contributing full scores to major studio films were still unusual enough in 1980 that both sides seemed to prefer working without the pressure of public attention. What emerged from that privacy was genuinely experimental, an album that worked as a standalone Queen record while simultaneously functioning as a sonic version of the movie itself. Something you could close your eyes and follow from beginning to end. The result was something the industry hadn't quite seen before and hasn't quite seen since. Decades on, it remains a definitive example of a rock soundtrack becoming genuinely inseparable from the film it was made for. Behind the golden smile and athletic frame of Flash Gordon was a voice that in many scenes didn't actually belong to the man on screen. Sam J. Jones clashed repeatedly with producer De Laurentiis during production, and by the time filming wrapped, The relationship had deteriorated badly. Jones departed before post-production was complete, leaving behind a film that still needed his voice to finish. The solution was a combination of looping and dubbing. In some scenes, Jones's own recordings were usable. In others, voice work was brought in to replace or supplement what had been captured on set. The result created an unusual disconnect between the physical performance, energetic, charismatic, and visually convincing, and the vocal delivery, which was assembled across different sessions and sources. For years, Jones spoke openly about his frustration with how the project unfolded. Curiously, the dub performance actually suits the film's theatrical and slightly surreal tone remarkably well. But knowing the backstory adds a strange layer to every scene in which Flash opens his mouth. Jones had prepared for the role with the seriousness a professional athlete brings to a competitive season. Daily runs and structured martial arts practice became the routine framework around which his days were built. The effort showed. Flash Gordon needed to feel like a man who had genuinely earned his reputation as a sports hero, not just someone in a fitted costume performing action beats. Jones's conditioning gave the performance an authentic physicality that telegraphed itself in movement, in posture, and in the ease with which he carried the role's more demanding sequences. This commitment was notable given how self-consciously theatrical the film was in almost every other respect. Against the extravagant sets and operatic villains and gleefully excessive tone of Mongo's court, Jones's grounded athletic presence gave the film an unexpected anchor, a real body moving through an entirely unreal world. Suggested using Flash's background as a professional football player as the engine for the fight itself, a connection the original script had left largely unexplored on a physical level. The result was a sequence in which ceremonial props, egg-shaped objects used in court, became makeshift footballs. Flash didn't fight like a soldier or a trained combatant. He fought like the quarterback he was supposed to be, using the object around him as extensions of a game he knew instinctively. The improvisation gave the scene a personality that set it apart from anything else in the film and quietly answered a creative challenge production had been wrestling with, namely how to make Flash feel distinctly American in an environment so alien and theatrical. The football sequence solved that problem in about 90 seconds of screen time. What began as a suggestion on set became one of the moments audiences most often remember, a rare example of an actor genuinely shaping his own character mid-production. There are moments in filmmaking where spectacle and genuine physical risk become almost impossible to separate, and the sky platform duel between Flash and Prince Baron is one of them. Constructed high above the studio floor, the set consisted of a narrow platform surrounded by spiked metal obstacles, rotating hazards, and almost no safe margin for error. Both Jones and Timothy Dalton performed significant portions of the scene themselves, navigating the elevated structure without the safety infrastructure that modern productions would consider absolutely standard. A misstep in any direction could have sent either actor into the metal pieces surrounding the platform. The finished sequence has an energy that's difficult to manufacture artificially. The tension reads as genuine because in many ways it was. Whatever risks were taken on that platform, the result is one of the most kinetic and memorable duels in science fiction cinema, charged with an urgency that still lands decades later. The environments constructed for film were on a scale that audiences sensed before they consciously registered. Production designer Danilo Donati's vision called for architecture that felt genuinely alien, and achieving that required building at a size that left no room for shortcuts. Some sets were so vast they could only be housed in aircraft hangars that had been repurposed for the production. Multiple stages ran simultaneously, each containing a different environment within Ming's empire. The throne room, the war rocket base, the ceremonial chambers, each existed as a full physical construction populated with hundreds of costume performers who filled the space with movement and texture. The sheer density of what was built gave the film a visual richness that communicated a complete world rather than a collection of cleverly dressed sound stages. It was an approach that required extraordinary resources, but the result was a version of Mongo that felt fully inhabited, a living place that no amount of clever camera trickery alone could have conjured. Some of the film's most visually striking images have an origin that audiences watching in 1980 never would have guessed. The alien skies of Mongo, those deep purples and burning oranges and slow-moving cloudscapes that gave the planet its otherworldly atmosphere, were not painted backdrops or early computer graphics. They were water. The effects crew injected colored dyes into large tanks and filmed what happened as the pigments expanded, collided, and drifted through the liquid. Footage captured at normal speed looked exactly like what it was, slowed down significantly in post-production. However, that movement transformed into something vast and atmospheric, with a weight and scale that felt genuinely planetary. The skies have a quality that remains difficult to replicate digitally precisely because they were created by actual physical matter behaving according to its own laws. Audiences sense something real even when they can't identify what they're looking at, and in this case, that instinct was entirely correct.